Nike just went off on Serena Williams by handing Alex Eala a $60 million contract they're calling the GOAT deal. The same brand that built an empire around Serena's dominance just positioned a 21-year-old Filipino player as the next face of women's tennis. And it happened immediately after Billie Jean King made a prediction that shook the sport. What started as a casual comment from tennis royalty escalated into corporate warfare that pitted legend against rising star, exposed fractures in Nike's priorities, and forced everyone to ask, is this about recognizing potential? Or is this Nike's calculated response to Serena demanding more than they wanted to give? The Arthur Ashe Kids Day event in New York brought together tennis legends, current stars, and promising juniors for an afternoon celebrating the sport's future. Billie Jean King, the 79-year-old icon whose activism had transformed women's tennis as profoundly as her championships, sat for interviews between watching exhibition matches featuring the next generation of players. A reporter asked the inevitable question: who would fill the void when Serena Williams finally retired? Who possessed the combination of talent and cultural significance to carry women's tennis into its next era? King paused, considering her response carefully. She'd fielded this question hundreds of times, usually offering diplomatic answers about multiple players contributing to the sport's future rather than anointing a single successor. But this time, something made her specific. She mentioned Alex Eala by name, calling her the player who could change everything, and drawing explicit comparisons between Eala's journey from Manila's public courts and Serena's rise from Compton's cracked concrete. The comparison wasn't random. King explained that tennis historically elevated players from privileged backgrounds, that the sport's infrastructure favored those with resources and connections. Serena had shattered that paradigm, proving that champions could emerge from neighborhoods tennis traditionally ignored. Eala represented a similar breakthrough, a player from a nation without tennis infrastructure, someone whose success would inspire millions in regions where the sport remained inaccessible. King suggested that Eala's impact could extend beyond individual achievements to fundamentally reshape where tennis found and developed talent. The comments immediately generated headlines. Tennis media seized on a legend explicitly naming Serena's potential successor. Social platforms erupted with debate about whether Eala deserved such lofty comparisons, given her current ranking and limited professional accomplishments. Filipino sports fans celebrated King's recognition. But the most significant audience for King's statement wasn't fans or journalists. It was Nike's executive team, who'd been searching for precisely this kind of cultural validation to justify a business decision they'd been contemplating for months. Nike had dominated women's tennis marketing for decades, largely because of their relationship with Serena Williams. They'd invested hundreds of millions building campaigns around her dominance, her cultural significance, her transcendence of sports into broader social conversations. The partnership had generated billions in revenue, establishing Nike as synonymous with women's tennis excellence. But Serena was approaching the end of her competitive career. Her playing schedule had diminished, her tournament results had become unpredictable, and her focus had shifted toward business ventures and family. Nike's strategic planning involved preparing for the post-Serena landscape. They needed someone to anchor their tennis division, to carry marketing campaigns in Asian markets where growth potential was enormous, and to represent the values Nike wanted associated with their brand. Multiple candidates existed: established stars, rising Americans, European players with Grand Slam potential, but none offered what Eala represented, an authentic connection to demographics Nike desperately wanted to capture, a compelling personal narrative about overcoming systemic barriers, and now, thanks to Billie Jean King, validation from tennis royalty that positioned Eala as a legitimate heir to Serena's cultural impact. 72 hours after King's comments went viral, Nike scheduled a press conference in Manila that would shock the tennis world and ignite a controversy exposing the ruthless calculations behind sports marketing's inspirational narratives. What Nike announced next would transform Billie Jean King's offhand prediction into corporate ammunition that destroyed a legendary partnership and forced an emerging star into a role she never requested. The Manila press conference took place at a luxury hotel overlooking the city, with Filipino media, international tennis journalists, and Nike executives filling a ballroom decorated with banners featuring Alex Eala's image. The presentation's production value signaled this wasn't a standard endorsement announcement. This was a statement. Nike's Asia-Pacific president opened by discussing the company's commitment to expanding tennis in developing markets, to identifying talent in regions traditionally excluded from elite sports, and to investing in athletes who represented more than competitive excellence. Then came the reveal. Nike was signing Alex Eala to a $60 million contract over 8 years. The deal included signature shoe lines, global marketing campaigns positioning her as the centerpiece of Nike tennis, and something unprecedented, branding the partnership as the next GOAT initiative, explicitly connecting Eala to the greatest of all time language Nike had used exclusively for Serena Williams throughout their partnership. The announcement included video montages comparing Eala's journey to Serena's, highlighting parallel narratives about overcoming systemic barriers, training on inadequate facilities, and proving doubters wrong. Nike executives repeatedly referenced Billie Jean King's recent comments, framing the deal as recognition of what King had identified, that Eala represented the same kind of transformative potential Serena had embodied 2 decades ago. The message was unmistakable. Nike was positioning Alex Eala as Serena Williams' successor, the next player who would define an era. Journalists immediately recognized something unusual about the timing and framing. Serena Williams' Nike contract was approaching expiration, and industry sources had reported ongoing negotiations that weren't progressing smoothly. Serena's team reportedly sought compensation reflecting her cultural value beyond current competitive results, arguing that her brand transcended tournament performance and justified premium terms even as her playing career wound down. Nike had apparently balked at the numbers, suggesting that endorsement deals should correlate with active competition rather than legacy value. Now, just days after King's comments created perfect cover, Nike was announcing a massive deal with an emerging player while using language, GOAT, defining the era, and transformative impact, historically reserved for Serena Williams. The optics were brutal. Nike appeared publicly demonstrating Serena's replaceability, showing her and every athlete they sponsored that legacy loyalty meant nothing when corporate strategy dictated moving in different directions. The press conference also revealed telling details about how Nike planned to market Alex Eala. Campaign materials emphasized her humble origins and against-all-odds journey in ways that seemed designed to create contrast with Serena, whose wealth and business empire had made her less relatable to younger demographics Nike wanted to capture. Marketing executives discussed Eala's authenticity and genuine connection to underserved communities with language that implicitly suggested these qualities had somehow diminished in Serena as her profile elevated beyond sports. Eala herself seemed uncomfortable during portions of the presentation. When asked about comparisons to Serena Williams, she responded diplomatically, expressing admiration for Serena's achievements while noting she was focused on her own career rather than replacing anyone. But her discomfort was irrelevant to Nike's strategic objectives. They had positioned her exactly where they wanted, as the fresh-faced alternative to an aging champion whose contract demands had become inconvenient. Within hours, the story wasn't about Alex Eala's endorsement deal. It was about Nike's apparent betrayal of Serena Williams, the most successful and culturally significant athlete in their tennis division's history. Serena's response would come swiftly, and it would expose the ugly reality of how even the greatest champions get discarded when corporations calculate they're more valuable elsewhere. Serena Williams didn't respond publicly for 48 hours, maintaining the disciplined silence that had served her throughout decades navigating media scrutiny. But sources close to her team began leaking details that painted a devastating picture of Nike's strategic maneuvering and disrespectful treatment of someone who generated billions for their brand. According to these sources, Serena had been negotiating a contract extension for months, seeking terms that reflected her cultural impact and marketing value beyond tournament results. She'd argued, reasonably, that her platform, her business ventures, and her status as a global icon made her valuable to Nike even as her competitive career approached its conclusion. She'd built Nike Tennis into a billion-dollar division, opened markets that hadn't previously cared about the sport, and associated their brand with excellence and social progress in ways that transcended athletics. Nike's negotiators had reportedly responded with cold financial calculations. They acknowledged Serena's past contributions, but suggested her future value was limited by reduced playing schedules and aging demographics. They'd offered renewal terms substantially below her existing contract, framing it as market reality rather than disrespect. When Serena's team pushed back, negotiations stalled, with both sides far apart on valuations and neither willing to compromise. Then, Billie Jean King made her comments about Alex Eala. Within 72 hours, Nike announced the $60 million next GOAT deal. The timing couldn't have been coincidental. Sources suggested Nike had been developing the Eala partnership for weeks, waiting for optimal timing to announce. King's statement provided perfect cover. They could frame the deal as responding to tennis royalties endorsement rather than admitting they'd decided to replace Serena with a cheaper, younger alternative who offered access to Asian markets they'd failed to penetrate through Serena's partnerships. What infuriated Serena's camp most wasn't that Nike signed another player. That was expected, even appropriate, as the brand prepared for tennis's next generation. The problem was the GOAT branding, the explicit positioning of Eala as Serena's replacement, and the complete lack of consultation or coordination with Williams despite her decades of partnership. Nike had used language sacred to Serena's identity, language they'd helped establish through years of marketing campaigns celebrating her as tennis's greatest, and applied it to someone else without even the courtesy of a private conversation explaining their strategy. The message was unmistakable and humiliating. Serena was replaceable, her leverage was gone, and Nike was prepared to publicly position her successor while contract negotiations remained unresolved. It was negotiation through public pressure, an attempt to force Serena to accept Nike's terms by demonstrating they had alternatives and weren't afraid to use them. Serena's longtime agent released a carefully worded statement expressing disappointment in Nike's approach, noting that partnership should involve mutual respect, and that recent developments had revealed priorities incompatible with continuing their relationship. The statement stopped short of confirming the contract dispute, but everyone understood the subtext. Serena was done with Nike, and Nike's treatment of her would become a case study in how even legendary athletes get discarded when corporate interests dictate. The tennis world's reaction would expose deep divisions about loyalty, legacy, and whether corporations owe anything to the athletes who build their empires. Tennis Twitter exploded into civil war. Serena's supporters, many of who had followed her career for decades, expressed fury at Nike's betrayal. They documented her contributions to the brand's tennis division, posted statistics about revenue she'd generated, and argued that loyalty should mean something when an athlete had delivered so spectacularly for so long. Hashtags like "Thank you, Serena" and "Nike Betrayal" trended globally as fans organized boycotts and called out the company's treatment of its most valuable tennis asset. But the backlash against Nike created collateral damage for Alex Eala, who'd become unwilling ammunition in corporate warfare. Filipino fans defending Eala pointed out that she'd earned recognition through her own achievements, that her contract wasn't about disrespecting Serena, but about Nike finally investing in Asian tennis markets. They argued that framing Eala's success as Serena's failure perpetuated exactly the zero-sum thinking that limited opportunities for women in sports. Why couldn't both athletes be celebrated without positioning one against the other? Tennis legends weighed in with predictably divided perspectives. Some veterans defended Nike's right to allocate resources based on business strategy, arguing that professional sports operated on performance and marketability rather than sentiment. They suggested Serena's team had overplayed their negotiating position, that demanding premium compensation while reducing competitive activity was unrealistic, and that Nike's pivot to Eala represented smart business rather than betrayal. Others condemned Nike's approach as symptomatic of how corporations extract value from athletes and discard them when convenient. They noted that Serena had carried Nike tennis during lean years when women's tennis struggled for mainstream attention, that her cultural impact had opened doors for every player who followed, and treating her as disposable sent a chilling message to every athlete about the worthlessness of loyalty once you'd served corporate purposes. The most fascinating debates centered on Billie Jean King's role. Had she unknowingly provided Nike with cover for a decision already made, or had she been complicit in corporate strategy? King issued a clarification stating her comments about Eala were genuine observations about talent and potential, not endorsements of any business decisions. She expressed support for both Serena and Eala, urging the tennis community to celebrate emerging talent without diminishing established legends. But skeptics questioned whether King's timing was truly coincidental, whether Nike had perhaps previewed their Eala strategy with her, knowing her endorsement would legitimize what otherwise looked like ruthless replacement of an aging champion. The speculation remained unproven, but persistent, another layer of complexity in a situation where everyone's motivations seemed murky. Sports business analysts provided cold assessments disconnected from emotional loyalties. They noted that Nike had made similar transitions with other aging superstars, that corporate strategy required planning for succession, and that Serena's reduced playing schedule made her less valuable for marketing campaigns requiring active competition. They predicted Nike would suffer short-term backlash, but ultimately benefit from positioning themselves in Asian markets, where growth potential dwarfed the diminishing returns from Serena's mature demographic base. Meanwhile, Alex Eala remained largely silent beyond her initial diplomatic comments, caught between gratitude for a life-changing endorsement deal and discomfort about being weaponized in disputes she hadn't created and couldn't control. Investigative reporting would soon reveal that the truth behind Nike's decision was even more calculated than anyone had suspected. Investigative sports business reporters began reconstructing the timeline that led to Nike's Eala announcement, and what emerged was a story of corporate strategy far more deliberate than Nike's public narrative suggested. Documents obtained from sources inside Nike's strategic planning division revealed that the company had been developing an Asian market expansion initiative for 18 months, long before Billie Jean King's comments and independent of Serena Williams' contract negotiations. The initiative identified tennis as a key growth opportunity in Southeast Asian markets, where rising middle classes were developing interest in sports previously inaccessible due to infrastructure limitations. Market research indicated that these demographics would respond more enthusiastically to athletes who reflected their own backgrounds and struggles rather than to Western stars, no matter how dominant. Nike needed an anchor athlete, someone with legitimate competitive credentials, authentic connection to target markets, and a personal narrative that aligned with the brand's messaging about overcoming obstacles. Alex Eala had been on Nike's radar for over a year. Talent scouts had identified her following her U.S. Open Juniors Championship, noting not just her tennis ability, but her marketability in precisely the demographics Nike wanted to capture. Initial partnership discussions had begun months before her recent professional breakthrough, with Nike developing contract structures and marketing strategies anticipating her continued development. Billie Jean King's comments hadn't prompted Nike's decision, they'd accelerated the announcement timeline. Nike had planned to reveal the Eala partnership during the off-season after finalizing details and preparing comprehensive marketing campaigns. But when King publicly positioned Eala as Serena's potential successor, Nike's executives recognized perfect timing. Announcing immediately allowed them to frame the deal as responding to tennis royalties endorsement rather than admitting they'd been planning to invest heavily in a player ranked outside the top 50. The next GOAT branding wasn't accidental or insensitive oversight, it was deliberate strategy. Nike's marketing team had debated extensively whether to explicitly connect Eala to Serena's legacy or position her independently. They ultimately decided that tying Eala to the GOAT narrative Nike had spent decades building around Serena created stronger initial market positioning than starting fresh with untested messaging. They calculated that short-term backlash from Serena supporters would be overwhelmed by the cultural currency of positioning Eala as the heir to tennis's most significant legacy. Most damningly, internal communications revealed Nike executives discussed using the Eala announcement as leverage in Serena's contract negotiations. Email exchanges referenced creating market pressure and demonstrating alternative strategic options to convince Serena's team that their negotiating position was weaker than they believed. The Eala deal wasn't just about signing a promising player. It was a negotiation tactic designed to force Serena to accept Nike's terms by proving her replaceability. When these revelations emerged through leaked documents and confidential sources, the narrative shifted. This wasn't a story about recognizing emerging talent or responding to Billie Jean King's insights. It was calculated corporate maneuvering that used both Serena Williams and Alex Eala as pawns in business strategy, prioritizing market expansion over loyalty to the athlete who'd built Nike Tennis into what it had become. The fallout from these revelations would reshape careers, relationships, and the understanding of how even the greatest champions get treated once corporations decide their value lies elsewhere. 6 months after Nike's announcement, the consequences were still unfolding in ways nobody had fully anticipated. Serena Williams signed with Puma in a deal reportedly worth less annually than Nike's final offer, but structured with equity stakes and creative control that Nike had refused to provide. Her departure from Nike after nearly 3 decades made headlines globally, with Serena's statement emphasizing partnership values and mutual respect as priorities that money alone couldn't satisfy. Nike's stock dipped temporarily following Serena's departure and the backlash over their handling of the situation, but recovered quickly as their Asian market initiatives began showing early success. The cold business calculation had proven correct. Short-term reputational damage was acceptable when balanced against long-term strategic positioning in markets worth potentially billions. Shareholders cared about growth projections, not loyalty to retiring athletes. Alex Eala carried the complicated burden of being Nike's chosen successor to Serena while never having asked for that role or the comparisons it generated. Every tournament result was analyzed through the lens of whether she was living up to the next GOAT branding Nike had imposed on her. Every loss generated commentary questioning Nike's judgment in positioning her so prominently. The pressure was immense, and Eala's performance fluctuated as she navigated expectations that would have crushed athletes with far more experience. More troubling was how the situation had fractured relationships within tennis. Some players viewed Eala as complicit in corporate disrespect towards Serena, refusing to acknowledge she'd been used as ammunition in disputes beyond her control. Others defended her, arguing she deserved opportunities on her own merits without being punished for Nike's strategic decisions. The divisions created tension in locker rooms and on tour, subtle hostilities that made an already isolating professional existence even lonelier for Eala. Billie Jean King reflected months later in an interview that her comments had been genuine observations about Eala's potential, but that she regretted how they'd been weaponized. She noted that women's tennis historically struggled with pitting players against each other rather than celebrating collective excellence, and this situation exemplified that destructive tendency. She emphasized that both Serena and Eala deserved support without diminishing either through unfair comparisons. The broader lesson was uncomfortable. Even Serena Williams, arguably the greatest tennis player in history and one of the most culturally significant athletes across any sport, was ultimately disposable to the corporate partner she'd enriched for decades. If Serena could be discarded when executives decided their interests lay elsewhere, what did that say about every other athlete's relationship with sponsors? What did it reveal about the illusion of partnership when contracts were simply business transactions that lasted as long as corporations found you useful? Sports business professors began using the Nike-Serena Eala situation as a case study in athlete empowerment and corporate power dynamics. They examined how brands leverage emerging talent to pressure established stars, how succession planning in sports marketing often involves brutal calculations disguised as celebrating the next generation, and how athletes, even legends, have far less leverage than public narratives about partnership and mutual respect suggest. For Eala, the question remained whether Nike's investment would ultimately benefit or burden her career. She had resources now that would have been unimaginable without the $60 million deal, but she also carried expectations and comparisons that could haunt her entire career, facing criticism that she'd been overhyped and used as a weapon against a legend who deserved better. The question we're left with isn't whether Nike made a smart business decision, it's whether the cost of that decision, measured in broken partnerships and weaponized athletes, reveals something rotten about how sports actually operate behind the inspirational narratives we're sold. Nike gave Alex Eala a $60 million contract they branded the Next GOAT deal, positioning her as Serena Williams' successor just days after Billie Jean King's prediction and while Serena's contract negotiations remained unresolved. What appeared to be recognition of emerging talent was actually calculated corporate strategy, leveraging Eala to pressure Serena, using King's comments as cover for decisions already made, and prioritizing Asian market expansion over loyalty to the athlete who'd built Nike Tennis into what it had become. The aftermath exposed brutal truths about power in professional sports. Serena left Nike after decades, signing elsewhere for terms that provided respect Nike wouldn't offer. Eala carries the weight of comparisons she never requested, positioned as Serena's replacement when she simply wanted opportunity. Nike's strategic gamble paid off financially while destroying relationships and exposing how even the greatest athletes are ultimately disposable when corporate interests dictate otherwise. 6 months later, the divisions persist. Serena thrives with new partners who value her beyond tournament results. Eala struggles under expectations that $60 million and premature GOAT branding created. And Nike's Asian expansion proceeds profitably, proving that in sports business, loyalty is an illusion, and legacy only matters until corporations find better returns elsewhere. Was Nike right to choose future markets over past loyalty? Did they betray Serena or make rational business decisions? Should Eala be celebrated for her opportunity or criticized for accepting a deal that weaponized her against a legend who deserved better? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if this story opened your eyes to how corporate sports actually operate behind the inspirational narratives we're sold, hit that subscribe button because we're exposing the truths they don't want you to see.